Welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios at the National Press Foundation. Funding for today's webinar on covering the federal budget was provided by the David Swit Endowment, Evelyn Y. Davis, and the Evelyn Y. Davis Foundation, and the NPF Training Fund. It's produced in collaboration with the Center on Congress at Indiana University and the Regional Reporters Association. And it's coming up right now. The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. Our mission includes journalists around the U.S. and around the world. I'm Linda Topping-Streitfeld, Director of Programs at the National Press Foundation. Joining me in the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios are Marilyn Geewax, Senior News Business Editor at National Public Radio, and Steve Gettinger, Deputy Managing Editor at CQ Weekly. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Good morning.
Steve, give us some budget basics. The President is going to release his budget on Monday. This is his proposal for fiscal 2016 spending. That's the year that starts October 1st. What's the best way, first of all, for reporters inside and outside Washington to get a copy of the budget?
It's gotten much easier. You used to have to go stand in line at the government printing office and have a courier bring back these heavy books, but now you just go online. Everything is at the Office of Management and Budget. So you just go to omb.whitehouse.gov or some variation of that.
Right. And
it's instantly put up at whatever hour it's scheduled for release, and there's more to comb through than you can imagine. You might want to take a look at what it is now just to get familiar with how many documents there are and how to get to one quickly that you might be interested in.
That's a good idea. And is the budget searchable online?
Yes, it is. It's easily searchable. Again, there's more information than you can handle immediately. So you might even try looking for Illinois or something and just get a feel for how quickly you can narrow down on something that's relevant.
Right. Good idea. So the budget comes out. What happens next? What's the order of events now?
Well, the budget is out. All of the agencies will be conducting briefings during the day on Monday, and a few might even slide into Tuesday. And if you're in Washington, if there's an agency that you're particularly interested in or that is relevant to whatever region you're interested in, it's best to go to that and get their briefing and their explanation. You do get a chance to ask questions.
Good. And what about Congress?
Congress will begin hearings. The budget committees in Congress will begin hearings the very next day, generally, with the head of the budget office and the Treasury Secretary and other officials, and you'll start to hear some of the controversies coming out then because, of course, we have a Democratic president and Republicans are in control of the budget committees in both chambers. So, but both parties get a chance to ask questions, and they'll largely be outlining their macro points during those hearings.
We've heard a lot about regular order. What does that mean?
Well, regular order would mean basically that that Congress would move according to the deadlines that are set down in the 1974 Budget Act, which means the houses can't take up the appropriations bills, which contain the real spending money, until after there's been a chance to adopt a congressional budget. So the first step is for each chamber to try and write a budget, and this year probably we expect the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee to get together and to conference a single budget that binds their further proceedings. The next step after that, though, is after May 15th, the appropriations committees can start writing the 12 spending bills that cover annual spending, and those will move through from their committees to the House floor probably in May and June. The Senate generally waits a couple of weeks to let the House get started, because by tradition the House starts spending bills. And they will be considering those bills in probably July and August. In theory, then, each bill would be, a final version would be hammered out between the House and the Senate in time for the end of the fiscal year, which is, the new fiscal year starts on October 1st.
Right. Can you put the budget in context for us a little bit? What funding is actually in play? And I think we have a pie chart to help explain this.
The focus of the political battles and the interest will be all about that green chart you're showing that has 29% of the total budget going for discretionary spending. That's the annual funding. How much does NASA get? How much does the military get for shipbuilding and current operations? Those are decisions that are made every year, and if they don't make a decision by October 1st, many of the government agencies have to close or go on to a low level of only essential services. So the October 1st deadline applies to the discretionary spending. As you can see, though, mandatory spending in this chart overwhelms everything else. It's 65% of the budget. And that's largely Social Security, Medicare, farm programs, and other operations that continue on their own without Congress making a decision. If they don't change anything, they just march forward year to year to year. And then there's a slice for the interest on the federal debt, which is 6% now. That is automatically paid, but we keep an eye on whether it's getting higher or lower, because that's money we can't use for other purposes.
Right. Where does defense spending fall in this? What color is defense spending here? Well,
some defense spending is mandatory, but most of defense spending is within that 29% slice, and it's about 50% of the total. Depends on whether you include the costs of the wars that we're trying to get out of, and that's a large slice that varies year by year, but nobody's really arguing over whether to raise or lower that.
Right.
The regular defense budget, as it always has been, though, is a good more than 40 to 45% of the budget.
Okay. And just to clarify for people watching, this chart was from fiscal year 2015. This is not the chart moving forward. This was last year's, but we just put it up here to give you a sense of where the bulk of the spending is. The political parties obviously have differences about the best ways to spend the nation's money. Can you kind of give us the broad outlines of that debate?
Well, for many decades now, the conflict has been over taxes and spending. The Republicans have been, since the 1940s, painting the Democrats as a tax and spend party, a party that wants higher taxes and then more spending through Congress rather than leaving it for individuals or states. And the Republicans have been very focused on trying to cut taxes. So in this instance, everything that President Obama proposes spending, which is most of the details in the budget, they're going to be looking at with a skeptical eye at any changes or new programs, and they will be trying to find room to keep those down in hopes that maybe we could trim taxes, at least symbolically or around the edges.
Right. And we should make clear, though, that when we cut taxes, that's also a form of spending, in that there's less money coming in. So overall, we have less money to spend.
Right, and some of these tax cuts will go to particular sectors, the oil and gas sector or individual industries, and so in a sense it's spending directed towards them.
Right. Can you give us a sense of the history? What is the background to all this? Is this how it's always been? You mentioned certain trends starting in the 40s.
Now, to go back to the beginning, the Constitution gives Congress the sole authority for spending money and for raising taxes. The Constitution also directed the President to prepare a budget and keep track of expenditures and revenues. That didn't even last a year after 1789. The Hamiltonians and the Madisonians were clashing, and really there was no federal budget. We went for 132 years without one. In 1921, Congress passed a Budget Act, which required the President to offer an annual budget and gave him authority. Prior to that, various agencies had gone directly to Congress and asked for what they wanted. So after 1920, it all went through the White House, and that bumbled along through until 1974, when Congress passed the Congressional Budget Control Act. It was after conflict with President Nixon, where he was trying to cut spending that Congress had appropriated, and Congress got very angry at this. He said he was fighting deficits and keeping inflation down. He started to be weakened by Watergate. Congress decided to rise up and wrote a bill to require and restrict what the president could do with money. He signed that a month before, in 1974, before he left office, after fighting it every step of the way. So that set our current process of congressional committees and how they proceed, and has had some important tweaks and changes and limits that get into the conversation, but that's the basic process.
All right, I want to get into, Marilyn, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention too, especially if you're fairly new to covering the budget process, to be prepared for the complete absurdity of the budget process, because it's very annoying and complicated, because really what the president is presenting is a blueprint. It's not, it's not what the budget's going to be. It's just his ideas about what should be our priorities. And then you have everybody else coming up with their ideas for what are the priorities. So you have the House, you have the Senate, you have the Democrats, the Republicans. There are really all of these different characters who have to all come to an agreement, and then, as you say, pass it 12 steps at a time, separate appropriations bills, before you finally get to October 1st. Well, the Congress works on a 2-year cycle, and yet, because it's just nuts, they do the budget every year. I mean, serious people will say that there should be a 2-year budget process where you work it out and figure out what this Congress wants to do, put it in place, and let it run for a while so that there's some certainty with the spending programs. But instead, Congress does this each and every year, and really, each and every year. When was the last time a budget passed in any kind of regular order? He's just described a systematic process that should play out, and you should know what the structure ought to be. But the reality for reporters is, Congress barely works 3 days a week when they get around to it. I mean, they're not in session to speak of on Mondays. They're certainly not going to work on Fridays. They take any time, if there's President's Day coming up, that's good for what, a 2-week break? I mean, Easter, any occasion is good. St. Patrick's Day, like whatever they can think of, they're out of town. So given that Congress takes many breaks, including basically all of August, which is the month before the budget expires, given their extremely limited work schedule, their frequent vacations, and this process that is very cumbersome and comes up each and every year, the process really becomes almost absurd, but you still have to cover it because it's very serious. We're talking about trillions of dollars, and it really matters, and it affects people's lives. So there's a temptation, I think, as a reporter to just go like, this is just too crazy to even cover. I can't keep up with this.
Well, so
and you
Marilyn,
need to be able to, steel yourself to the craziness of it and realize that October 1st is going to come. The government may or may not shut down. Brilliant scientists who are in the middle of some important work at NIH will have to leave their laboratories. People who are doing, protecting our parks, our monuments, they may or may not be laid off randomly in October. So it's very hard, really, not to become disgusted and annoyed and just almost joking about it when really this is a very serious matter caught in a very absurd process.
I agree. And I want to make sure before we finish, I want to get to a couple of basic points like dynamic scoring, the continuing resolution, the sequester, et cetera. But Marilyn, as long as you're on this, I know one of the things that you do is help reporters develop actual stories around the budget. So let's talk about that for a minute. If I'm a reporter and I'm looking to develop a story for my audience, how do I look at this giant budget and figure out who to call?
To me, you can always get information. The staffers actually on the Hill, it can be very helpful, and they'll explain things, and lobbyists as well. I mean, they know the budget very well. That's what they get paid to do, is to understand the budget. So there are lots of good sources at OMB and throughout the Hill. But the thing to me as a reporter is to take seriously this responsibility of translating these budget numbers into people's lives so that we can relate to how important this budget really is. Just some things that I was thinking about. The Highway Trust Fund is a budget issue, and that's something that they spend money on. The current, because Congress works in ways that are just so bizarre, it keeps being extended temporarily instead of really reauthorized. So its current expiration date is May 31st. So if you're working on a summer road project, is the money going to be there after May 31st, or isn't it?
Who knows?
It's all, the whole thing is like so absurd that you don't know what to even say to that. So what a good concrete story might be is to look at what projects were supposed to be done this year. What were you hoping for your community to see done, and what's on the chopping block? Is Congress going to reauthorize it or not? But it's not just enough to me to come up with a list of, this is the road that should be done. I realize that this is time consuming as a reporter, but to find the worker, the contractor who needs to know, should I buy more asphalt? Am I going to have this job? Right. Find the worker who, maybe a school teacher who counts on that summer job working construction to really, put money aside for their kids' college or whatever. Are you going to have that job this summer? Is there going to be a road project in your community? How long can Congress put this off before they decide on this highway thing? What roads and bridges are becoming increasingly dangerous in your community? So these aren't just numbers in a budget. They matter to your community. They matter to workers, to commuters, and to try to find ways to look for not just the numbers, but to get it down to the specific streets, and then find the specific people who live on those streets or use those streets. And I understand
as reporters,
that is,
we know that some of the best stories are really in the details. What are some other elements of the budget that you think might be fertile? Even
some of these things that are kind of the blue sky, like the president, proposing the child care the tax credit to help people pay for child care. That's something where I think there may be some room for agreement. I don't know if you're seeing the same stories that I am, but it seems like some people are saying that maybe there is room for that to actually get done. Well, look around your community. What is the situation with child care? In your specific location, are there enough? What if there were a lot more kids who could go to child care? Are there child care centers? How long does it take to get one up and running? Is there a pent-up demand, or are child care centers sitting there empty with slots just waiting for kids? Find a couple. You know what I would do is, I think is try to find a couple of couples or a couple of households, a couple of people who want to put a child into child care so that somebody could go back to work, right, because you haven't been able to work because you've got a kid. And follow them over the next 2 years. Does it make a difference in their lives to get this tax credit? And set up a narrative arc. Sometimes I've done stories where it takes a year to bring, 2 years to bring the story to fruition. But when you're done, you can file intermittent stories. But the big story arc that you're finally getting to is maybe you don't run that story until the State of the Union in 2017, 2 years from now. The president, you can say, here's what the president said back in January of 2015. Here's how these people's lives changed in 2017. That takes reporting commitment. You need to find people. You need to visit them with some regularity, check back. You need to do updates on your story. But ultimately, you get, a prize-winning quality story that helps people in your community understand what happened. Yeah. So I'm always looking for that human element of how do you make stories come to life. And, I think that's one of the things that makes NPR beloved, is that we try to find those stories and get you into the person's house and sit out there. We call them kitchen table stories,
right,
where you sit down with the family and hear, how does this, we're on the radio, it's not good to hear a bunch of numbers, but it is good to hear people's stories.
Absolutely. And I'm going to let you get away with the plug for NPR. Is there anything else specific that you wanted to talk about in terms of a potential story angle?
Well, I think that all of the things he's talked about, these specifics of understanding the process, is the basics. I mean, you've got to understand what you're trying to do, but then once you understand how the process is supposed to work, brush off the absurdity, look for the concrete, and translate it what is important in your community. And for some people, maybe in some smaller towns, maybe the community college is a big deal for your town, and the president is talking about free community college. Right. Go to and talk to the people at the community college. Are there enough professors? Are there adjuncts just dying to be able to expand and get a real job? Are there kids who maybe had to pay for a more expensive opportunity at Kaplan or a Strayer or something like that, and they would love to go for free to their community college?
Right. Are there employers in your town who would love to have some community college graduates?
Or or does it create some kind of a log jam that just frustrates people even more? I mean, in all of these numbers that we've talked about, in all of this process, these are really important stories. And I think that when we're in Washington, my point is just that it's easy to get caught up in sort of the horse racy aspects, the personalities, the fights on the Hill. Don't lose sight of what matters, which is the citizens, the people who are really affected by this. And that's where you need to direct your stories. That's where the interest is, and to make it so that people don't just laugh off Congress, but to understand this is our money, this is our country, this is our future. Connect your audience with what those budget reports show.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, one of the big debates that we're all going to be caught up in is this discussion of the increasing federal deficit and federal debt. Can you explain, first of all, what's the difference between those two things? What are we talking about when we say federal deficit, federal debt?
Well, the deficit is how much less we take in every year than we spend.
So that's an annual number.
And for every year since 2001, we've been spending more than we took in. So that is where the annual deficit comes.
Right.
We borrow that money,
right,
and pay it off later. Say the economy will get better, things will turn around.
Right, and that's that 6% that we saw on the chart. I think it was 6% annual payments on the deficit, or
on the debt.
On the debt.
The deficit every year, if you run deficits of $500 billion a year, which is the unimaginable number that we've gotten used to and wish we could get back to. If you do that 2 years in a row, you've got a $1 trillion addition to the debt.
Okay.
The debt goes all the way back to the early years. It's always been considered sacrosanct that we pay our debts. But it's been a long time since we've actually paid them down. We do, and particularly when there's an economic boom, we do reduce the long-term debt. Right. But it's been a long time. We wish for those days, and the amount of interest keeps growing as we don't pay it down, and that just hamstrings our economy a little bit.
Right. There's also a move this year to require all big bills to be scored by the Congressional Budget Office with an eye toward their long-term impact on sort of the overall economy. This is something called dynamic scoring. Can you explain what it is, and is it a big deal?
Dynamic scoring, if I can, is not really a big deal as it's being discussed. It's trying to take account of the macroeconomic effects. If you cut taxes, will people make more money in jobs, and will some of that money come back into the Treasury to offset the cost of it? Republicans in general are very eager for dynamic scoring on tax bills. They now generally will admit that a tax cut never pays for itself, but that some of the money from the stimulation of the economy comes back in, and that the Congressional Budget Office should try to give us a range of what those likely effects are. It's just a guess, but there's nothing wrong with the idea. Much of the tension, though, is that Democrats say, well, what about spending bills? What if we had a big highway construction program and we increased a lot of spending on infrastructure? That would create a lot of jobs. It would, throughout the economy, many people would go to work. They would be paying taxes. We would get some of the money we spent back from increased economic activity, faster shipments, more people going to work. Well, Republicans aren't really interested in making the way easier for big spending projects. So you have a tension. They seem to be going at it in a reasonable fashion so far. Everybody's just worried that it's going to get out of hand year after year. Another loophole.
Right. Another question I have is about the sequester. We heard about this last year. It was a disaster. It was supposed to be a disaster, but it happened. Where do we stand with that now? Are we still in the sequester?
Go ahead. If you want.
We aren't really. It happens every year. We do a great deal to trim it off, but the idea of the sequester is to threaten dire consequences if you don't do something about it. So right now, for instance, the military and defense spending is headed for a serious cut that would make their weapons procurement go on hold and cut the number, could even force us to cut the number of troops overseas or something. That looms very large in everyone's consideration now. It's up to Congress between now and October 1st, or whenever they finally do pass a budget, to make that situation better, make sure it doesn't happen, and there'll be a lot of horse trading. Do you exempt the military, but do you keep it on domestic programs? That's what all the horse trading will be about.
Mm-hmm. Excuse me, but can I just say again that as a caution to reporters, this is, there's more drama on the Hill than on like Broadway. I mean, you have a lot of times when you're told that if this doesn't happen, we're going to go over the cliff, and the debt crisis and the sequester, and for political purposes, people really explain things in very dire terms. Mm-hmm. And it can be difficult as a journalist because, sometimes dire things do get pretty dire. I mean, if we really didn't pay our debts, it might have a big impact or whatever. But there have been so many false alarms in a way. In the August of 2011, there was a debt ceiling crisis, and everybody said, oh, if we don't pay do this right now, the interest rates will go through the roof. And kind of nothing really happened. I mean, and they worked it out, and in the end, we have a way of muddling through these things, and the sequester was supposed to have just to turn everything upside down, and they find ways to muddle through. There's always a loophole. There's a way to restore a little bit of funding. So trying to find that right balance between not being too melodramatic, because you don't want to fall for every political trick in the book where they try to make it seem like we're on the edge of disaster or the edge of nirvana, where we may just, everything will come together. most of the time, 99% of the time, you're going to just find a way to muddle through, and it's not going to be the drama that is hyped. So trying to find that that balance, that experience. Talk to people when you're doing things. Don't just listen to the most hysterical political point of view. Talk to people who've been around the Hill a long time, and maybe bring some context to your stories where you note that usually, one way or the other, it's not quite as dire as you might think at the moment.
Right.
Two things to keep in mind here are it's human nature not to make any decisions until you're forced to, until the end. And it's become almost orthodoxy in Congress. You never give anything up. You never concede anything until the very last second. Right. And the other thing that's happened in the last 25 years is Congress has invented overtime. They can stretch things out. Well, let's just do another week before we get tough. Let's do another month. Let's do 6 months. And they can keep stretching things along so that real decisions almost never get made until there is no end to the process. It can stretch well into halfway through the next fiscal year before the differences finally get narrowed to so little that people can say, okay, let's walk away from this with each of us getting half of what we want.
And you know, there is a price to be paid for these constant, as they call them, CRs, continuing resolutions, where no decision is actually made. They just continue with a CR, as they call it. You know, from a business point of view, it's you know, it certainly is not optimal. I mean, you know, you would like to know what the highway funding bill is. You'd like to know what airport expansions are going to be in the next, you know, 10 years or whatever. It would be nice to get to December and be able to plan your taxes without having to wait until the last second that Congress is in session to find out what the tax year was. And a lot of times they make them retroactive. You don't even know during the tax year where you're making the decisions, you don't even know what kind of treatment it will get until after they make it retroactive. So, you know, it's very tough a lot of times on businesses, on workers, on researchers, anybody who's trying to come up with a plan for how they're going to, you know, what's going to happen next. This really is harmful to the economy. It's got to shave GDP by what percent, I don't know, but it is a restraint on growth for Congress to be unable to make these decisions. On the other hand, as I said, there is this muddling through approach where, you know, it certainly is less than optimal. It is a restraint on business, but it's usually not ultimately catastrophic because in the end they figure out a way to make something work and they pass another CR and then we move on.
Well, that sounds like a good note for us to wrap up on. It sounds like we've got kind of some broad outlines for reporters here. Talk to real people, look for the impact of the budget on real people. Don't get caught up in the hysteria, and talk to people who've been around for a long time who can give you some historical context when you're doing your budget reporting. I would urge everyone to go to our website, which is www.nationalpress.org. We will have more resources for your budget coverage there. And in the meantime, thank you very much, Marilyn and Steve. As always, we're very grateful for funding from the David Swit Endowment, Evelyn Y. Davis, and the Evelyn Y. Davis Foundation, and to our partners, the Center on Congress at Indiana University and the Regional Reporters Association. And thank you for joining us in the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation, where we are making good journalists better. Thanks.
Thank you.
It was great.